I'm beyond delighted to be able to welcome Miguel Escobar Varela here to Cultural Analytics and the iSchool and the Berkeley Institute for Data Science. I've been a great fan of his work for years, and it's a long trip for him to make from Singapore. And so when he accepted this invitation, I immediately thought we should build a week around it. So not to put any pressure on you, Miguel, but the multimodal models week, the planning for it started when you said yes, and then I was delighted that both Taylor and Laura also said yes, and so then we had a week, and so we built this entire week around the three of you. So this is so like I said, it's a great honor to be able to introduce Miguel, who's an associate professor in the Department of English, which he just kind of pointed out is a bit not where his home is, even though that's where his hat is. Linguistics and Theater Studies. He's also the deputy director of the Center for Computational Social Sciences and Humanities at the National University of Singapore, where he also plays a role as residential faculty in one of the colleges. In his research, he studies the changing landscape of Southeast Asian cultural heritage by combining fieldwork with computational methods. So he does not know it, but he's a computational folklorist, such as natural language processing, computer vision, and network analysis. He's the author of Theater as Data, and papers, data sets, and research software are available at his homepage. He's a well-known scholar of Wayang, the shadow puppet plays of Southeast Asia, and he's going to talk to us today about what dance scholars can learn from warehouse surveillance Emic approaches to temporal action segmentation. So Miguel.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that very generous introduction. And thank you also for organizing this. You're the most gracious host. This has been amazing to really hang out with everybody here. Also, shout out to Lini and all the organizational crew behind making this happen. We've had a fantastic week so far. I've learned so many things from other speakers, students, and participants. I'm really intimidated, I have to say. It's really a hard act to follow with all the great talks that we've seen this week. And also, we've been seeing from theater, music, film, images, memes, conspiracy theories, and everything in between. And I'm going to talk a little bit about cultural heritage. And as Tim said, my hat is at the Department of English, but I'm very much like a Southeast Asianist at heart. And I study these traditions from Southeast Asia that some people here might be very familiar with. Tim certainly is. He studied with the one of the legends in the field with Amin Sweeney, who was like a scholar of the Malay shadow play from Kelantan and Patani area, like the border between Malaysia and Thailand. And but some people here are not probably super familiar with this. So can I actually see a show of hands? How many people have seen a Wayang show before? Okay, very good. I also see Carmen is in the audience because from Malaysia originally, and a few people have heard me speak about this before. But still, since I have more time now than I usually do for these kinds of talks, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on the context of the things that I'm actually studying, and then the computational stuff will come later. So don't worry at the beginning if you think that you wander in the wrong lecture. There will be computational things coming up. So this is structured as a play in three patets. So patet one, we have a case study and motivation for temporal action segmentation, TAS. Then the second patet is a brief overview of TAS and its application. And then the third patet is a theoretical musing and future directions. So I'll begin by telling the court here assembled about news from a faraway place, where we care about how performances have changed in recent years. So actually, why I'm I'll tell you a bit more about this is sometimes it's described as shadow play. So just hold this question in the back of your heads for a moment. So we'll come back to what does it mean to study change, what does it mean to study it computationally. We'll get there. But let me tell you a few things about it that, as I said, it's sometimes this gets described as shadow play, but that's a bit of a misnomer. So a more kind of direct translation could be like leather puppets. And as you can see from the image here, in Java, people primarily see the dalang, who's like the performer. You can see there, like a little bit like the head of the dalang and an assistant behind. So you see like two heads over there, and you can see both that these puppets are both painted and carved. There's a light source and there's a shadow that is projected on a screen. And in theory, you could go behind the screen and also watch the shadow side. But in Java, at least, nobody does this. We don't really have an answer of why. This has been puzzling visitors to Java for at least 200 years. So, like back in the 19th century, a bunch of ethnographers and linguists, primarily from the Netherlands, were there, would ask people like, how come you guys watch the front and not the shadows? And people came up with a variety of answers. It's hard to know what's the real one. This is a bit different in other traditions that are adjacent. So, in the things that Sweeney studied in Clantan, people actually watch the shadows. If you go to Bali, there's a Balinese shadow play, which is you actually watch the shadows. And by the way, there's like a very famous Balinese gamelan that historically was based here in Berkeley. So if you go close to the BART station, that is like close to here, you will hear snippets of the recordings from this. They have like this historical radio from all kinds of radio stations, including from this like Sekat Jaya, which is like a very famous Balinese one. But anyways, I'm getting distracted. Let me just show you kind of like a sense of how this looks. And again, this will be just a bit of a introduction to Wayang. Here we see the late great Kiseno Nugroho, a master of the form. And just to kind of give you a sense of how these things look like. So you have a screen. You have like the dalang, that's like the puppet master who speaks all the character voices and also controls the orchestra by saying things that are indications for music to play, but also by controlling like a wooden mallet with a chimpolo, where you play certain patterns, and then like the audience, the musicians know what to play. And then so the audience is like kind of around the dalang. And as I said, sometimes you can go behind the screen and there could always be like a few tourists perhaps that are taking photos from the shadow side, or like, a few spectators that like to do that. But sometimes this might also be recorded, and sometimes the screen might be placed like, flush against the wall. And, the other thing that you can see here is that these performances are very well attended. So like a typical performance would have like 1,000 people in the audience. So, and they're still pretty common today, as we'll see in a moment. And other things that you can see here is that often people are engaging in, like these are very long performances, by the way. So that's 7 hours. They used to be even longer. And it's normal for people to eat throughout the performance. So it's also kind of like, very cool that we're like all the time, having some food here and we talk about this. And, if you go to a performance, you also have like a different, menu over the night. So at some point in the middle of the night, there'll be like coffee coming through if you stay on to the very end of the performance. And, other things that are interesting is that, people can also sleep through a performance. So not all the segments of a performance are equally interesting. So if anybody feels like, dozing off as I speak, that's entirely culturally appropriate for this topic. And many things have remained same from distant past. So the oldest diagram, the oldest visual representation that we have of a performance of Oriental, as far as I know, is from 1846. And here you can see many similarities. So I'm just going to point out a few different things. I don't know if this is working. Here we go. So you see the dalang over here. You can see like this is kind of like a puppet in the middle. You can see like there's a bunch of puppets that are arranged to the left and the right. We call that the simpingan. And you can see that same structure here. So these are usually not used in performance. They're just for decoration. Unless at some point you manage to break a puppet, so some of the fight scenes can get pretty rowdy. So if you do break a puppet in the middle of a performance, you go to your assistant and you try to scramble to get a puppet, pluck it out and bring it here. So other things, people are assembled around the dalang. You can also see that people are watching, even in the 19th century, from the front, not from the shadow side. Some people are sleeping, which is also very common. They're like some babies. So this is like somebody sleeping, somebody yawning. Some babies in the audience, a naked child. These are all occurrences that are also common today. Maybe the only thing that is like a bit of historical anomaly is that there's this person here that appears to be smoking opium. That's not particularly common these days, but everything else is many of these things have remained, not unchanged, but similar from a long time ago. So this is a performance tradition with a 1,000-year history, at least, of like continuous performance, as we know from various records. It's still pretty popular today. We have like about like 5,000 performances per year. It's also like a very prestigious art form. So I don't know, like, depending on where you're coming from, puppetry might not seem to be the most prestigious art form, but in Indonesia, it's like a lot of the symbols of the royal courts of the government are derived from the mythology of wayang, from the imagery of wayang. So it is something that is not for children. It's like, it's a very long, very sophisticated performances when it comes to the literary references. The language that they use is complex and poetic, but it's also like lots of different things. And I'll get to some of those things in a moment, because this will be important for how we try to study change computationally. So it's like highly codified form. And so in a moment, this is just somebody asked me what was the oldest reference in one of the conversations. So this is like the oldest inscription from the 10th century. It's like the oldest record of a wayang kulit performance. So they're talking about a performance that was offered to a king. And so like just to see like the imagery of wayang is like present. This is like in the city of Yogyakarta, where I used to live before. You can see images from the puppets adapted to different things. And you also have all kinds of like, contemporary adaptations. I'm going to skip to some of that for now, but okay, let me show you kind of, one of them. So here we see like a geotemporal analysis of performance patterns. This is a project that we did a few years ago, where we look at mentions of wayang kulit performances in Java. So like this part over here, this is like the island of Java, which is divided into different like linguistic regions. So not to bore you with the details, but like you can see like an area over here where there's not many performances. That's because they speak a different language called Sundanese, which is totally separate from Javanese. The main language of performances here, so you can see like, we extracted mentions to performances from social media and other records, and then we try to verify how much of that is captured, how much of that is not. So we estimated back then that about 90% of the performances are captured in social media. I can talk more about that if anyone's curious, and we can see like there's some patterns, some temporal patterns over time. But so there are some times in the year where there's more performances and some where there's less. And there's also, okay, well, so let me show you, I'm going to show you also kind of like a very interesting phenomenon now, which is many of these performances have been uploaded to YouTube. So these performances are semi-improvised, as I'll show you in a bit more detail in a moment. So, and often they're live streamed on YouTube. So there will be somebody with like a camera or like a phone recording the entire performance and then uploading it to YouTube. So we can see like the number of wayang kulit recordings per year has increased. We don't think that the number of performances itself has increased because of these other sources of data that we have, like the social media. We think that the number of performances is kind of stable, but the number of things that are being recorded has increased over time. So here we have like about 7,000. So like a typical year we have like between like 5,000 and 7,000 performances. But the more we move into the present, the more you have uploaded to YouTube. That's because phones get better, so a phone can record like 7 hours of performance. Also, internet capacity is better, so you can like live stream the entire thing with very basic technology. And also, we start to see more full-length performances. So here we see the solid line is the median duration over time. So you can see now that the typical performance in the past 2 years uploaded to YouTube is like 5 hours long. And whereas like 10 years ago, 12 years ago, you'd have like more like snippets. Okay, so we have a ton of data on YouTube, and we are going to come back to what we can do with that in a moment. Just some interesting thing. You can also look at some number of views of the performances over time. And just to tell you, like the median, so this is like, it's not like looking at the most popular one, like the median, of course, a more robust description of what's going on. So the median view in 2014 is like 5,000 views for a wayang kulit video. So I don't know if anybody here has a a YouTube channel. I have a YouTube channel, that has like, let's say that I'm on a very different like order of magnitude, popularity. And so here, like, even these, just think about that for a moment. These are like extremely long, complex poetic forms that are 7 hours long. It might be that people just watch it for a few seconds, but still there's like a community that cares about this stuff. And you can see that there's like this spike here on the number of like the median views in 2019 was like about 20,000. Can anybody guess why that could have been?
COVID.
COVID. Well, maybe it's a bit of both. So it's COVID. Like, so during COVID times, you could still produce performances. They were produced. You could assemble with your musician friends and record the performance, but you could not go to watch one live. So I think you can see that here. It's okay. This is that some. It doesn't tell us exactly how many people are watching the performances on a normal time, but it tells you that this is not a dying tradition by any extent. So, okay, we're now going to talk a little bit about the structure of a show. And you might recall from my first slide that I said that this talk is structured in 3 pathets. And maybe you were wondering, like, what on earth is a pathet? So a pathet is a way to divide the performances. So a typical performance in the kind of like Surakarta tradition, there's like variations here, of course, but in the most kind of prestigious version of the form is divided into these 3 narrative segments called pathet. And a pathet also corresponds to the music, but let's not get there, that's a different thing. And this is a bit different from acts, like, as you might think of that in a kind of like a Western tradition, because the pathet is connected to places. So a pathet is like a general section of the performance. And then you have like a adegan. So an adegan will be a scene within that performance. And the performances must always begin at a court, which is, so you might have, remember that I address you as a court because that's how you begin a performance. So I used to have like this exercise with my students that I said, take a story that you like. It can be like, say like Star Wars or The Lion King, Frozen, and then try to reconfigure it so that it's using the narrative structure of a Wayangate performance. So there should always be like a formal chord scene at the beginning. Then you have like a limbuhan, which is like a first comic interlude, which is, it's not necessarily that super funny. I'll show you some examples in a moment. But it's like called a comic interlude, where basically you have like the servants that have been eavesdropping on the court, and then they comment on what's happened. They, rehash what's happened in a more like, accessible form of the Javanese language. And then there's some humor there. And then you have like developments in Other Kingdom, some battles. Then you have like the second pathet where you have like a larger comic interlude. You have like a meditation scene. And then you have like, so there's like things that must happen in a performance. And so typically like the interludes that we see here in Bloom are a bit like, they're long, So interlude is perhaps not the right term for this in English. These are segments that are at least 30 minutes long. So it's not like an interlude as an aside, but it's like a longer narrative break from the performance. So, okay, let's show, so maybe to try to bring this a bit more to something concrete, let me show you a couple of projects that we did in the past for studying these performances. So this is remediation of the book. Oh, actually, I already had it open here. So let me zoom out a little bit. So, so one of my mentors, Professor Bernard Arps from Leiden University, spent 30 years working on this book, this translation, this annotated translation of a very famous story. And this is like a 7-hour performance. He published it first as a book. And then this is like a publicly available version of that book where the video recording is linked to the text. So let me just show you. Okay, thank you very much. I was doing this very embarrassing thing when I'm talking about something you cannot see. So thanks for that. How do we get out of this? Second. Okay, here we go. Okay, so Bernard wrote this book. It's like a 700-page doorstopper that has all these extremely detailed annotations. So it's like a transcription of the performance in Javanese, translation into English, and then annotations of everything that is happening in a scene. So this is like a 7-hour long. If you were to watch like end to end, which it's delightful. I really recommend it. Like if you have no plans for the weekend. Okay, so here, I mean, there's like a bunch of notes here that you can read, like, about like explaining all the allusions. So this is like a highly codified form. That what I want to get across with this image here is that this is a very layered performance with all kinds of like historical, poetic allusions in terms of the puppet movement, in terms of the stories, in terms of the music. And if you want to learn more about that, you can go here. And here we have like the structure. So you can see here, like, I hope you can see it. It's probably a bit too small. First patet here. We have the audience. That's where we are now. Then we go to the comic section, which in this particular performance is not, particularly funny or not funny. Okay, so here you have like these kind of two characters that these are the servants. And then in this particular scene, they are joking, and we were talking about humor at some point before that it's a bit culturally specific. So even if I were to explain to you why this is funny, you'd be like, oh yeah, funny, but it's not like like it's hard to never get the humor. And I would say this particular performance is amazing, but it's not particularly funny. This is like the line that passed away recently, an eminence in the field. He was known for his voice, but not for his humor. Then again, so anyway, so here. What I'm trying to also convey to you is that there's this very deep tradition of scholarship around Guayaquil about annotating things that people would spend like 30 years of their lives annotating this one performance, tracing all these allusions, and the ways in which people are constantly reinterpreting the performance. Let me show you kind of like, so again, like here you can see that it's structured in these segments, in these scenes. We did this other project, a lot of people like network here, like anybody, so this is, we did a network of these performances. I'm not going to go into that too much, but we looked at, this is a co-occurrence network of characters in a particular story. So stories are, let me just look at this particular character here called Senkunin. And you can see here that we have like the stories, and let's take this one, Tewo Ruchin, which is the same one here. So typically, when the Dalang performs, he would be mostly he. I mean, there's female Dalangs, but it's a very male-dominated art form. So Dalang would have this thing called like the palungan, which literally means skeleton. So you have like this skeleton, and like this would be like the entire 7 hours or 9 hours will be based on this skeleton. So you improvise along this structure. A bit like academics when they did the same talk for a different audience, and you can remove a few slides, add a few slides. You don't exactly know what you're going to say, but you kind of, you've done it before. You hope for the best, and you can adjust if you're running out of time, as might happen to me. So I'm getting a bit carried away with these explanations. But this is kind of basically, so the Dalang would have like these kind of little notes, and of course there's like a mini kind of balungan. You can have like you can borrow a scene from somebody else here and there, but basically it's like these. There's all these wonderful metaphors because this is the skeleton. So when you perform, you add flesh, you add personality, you add hair to this creature that you are bringing to existence. And this means also that every performance, every night is different. So if you were to look at, renderings of like say Hamlet or, other, canonical plays, sure, there's adaptations, but usually like, it will be adapted by a director and every night will be the same over a season. Here, it's different every night. And you have like different stories. I can tell you a million things about how a story is chosen, but I will try to hold my tongue from now on that. But this is just to give you like a sense of why we might care. So I'm just trying to motivate the question of why a computational approach might be relevant for this very culturally specific way of thinking about how we structure narrative sequences. And this is like this is all interactive, by the way, if anyone wants to. So you have like networks over for each and I think it's also kind of interactive, so you can go to a particular scene and you can see the sub-network of that scene, and then you can see here the overall structure of the universe of these characters, which are taken originally from South Asian stories, so the Mahabharata and Ramayana, but recontextualized for a Javanese audience for over centuries. Anyways, so I think I've done enough table setting now to convince you that this is a very old tradition, very well studied. It's very prestigious. It's also very complex. And I only gave you like one dimension of that complexity, which is how you structure the narrative segments. So people disagree about many things in this performance, and many of them assert that comic interludes are increasingly longer over time. Some people, like again, these are all kind of like mentors of mine. So this is like, so we have like Professor Jan Rasek has like this book, Phenomenology of a Puppet Theater, where he talks about this increasing moment of these comic interludes, and he sees that as a positive thing generally. And then he would have like Dr. Kitsy Emerson in this other book where she kind of like talks about the controversies, how many people decry how that these comic interludes in their increasingly longer duration are detracting from the philosophical core of the vernacular performance. So we can disagree. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? But are the comic interludes actually getting longer? So now we're getting to a place where we can have a potentially testable empirical question. So, people have been saying that they've been getting longer since the 90s. So, at some point you need to reach a ceiling, right? They cannot get longer all the time, otherwise you'll get to a ridiculous point where it's only comedy or there's like, more comedy than the performance duration. So this is something that we wanted to test. We wanted to know, this might not be the question that keeps you up at night. Are the comic interludes getting longer? But it's a question that matters to an interpretive community in Indonesia and beyond. People care about this. People would, definitely fight over whether it's a good thing or whether it's a true thing. So we found our question, and now we want to know, is this actually the case? So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the comic interlude. Am I doing the time? Okay, I think it's still got it. Bit more time. Okay, very good. Okay, at some point, if you start to kind of like, I can,
Dozing off here. No.
Very good, excellent. Yeah, that's perfectly appropriate at this time. So okay, let me tell you a bit more about the comic interlude and the formal characteristics of the interludes. So again, I think that this is a question that could be answered quantitatively, empirically. It's sufficiently narrow and well-defined. It matters to a community of practice. It has clear conventions that are changing slowly. So that's another thing. Wankley is like a great case study because you have these conventions that are not entirely set in stone. So I think other forms like non-theater changes a lot more slowly. Here, people are a bit more open to change. I mean, actually, Wank has always changed over time. From being primarily like a story about like, these Hindu, like South Asian religious setting. Then Islam came to Indonesia, so they adapted that into the story. Then the Dutch came and it changed to something. So they've always adapted things from outside. So they're very open to change, and yet you have conventions. So it's this like interplay between conventions and change that makes it also it's the kind of thing that you can study with these kinds of methods. We also have a very large data set from YouTube. So this is a computationally trackable question, or so I believe. Okay, so characteristics, so you usually have like specific puppets. I showed you an example earlier about there's like the female clowns. This is another one called Petruk. Now, the thing about, so things that you have is that you have specific puppets, you also have humor, you have some interaction with the audience. Sometimes audience members will get invited on stage, and you typically like roast them, like the language, like they would like, there's no, fourth wall to break, but they would be like, would speak directly to the audience and make fun of the guests. By the way, if you happen to be like a foreign researcher doing a PhD on this stuff, you are the prime target for that. You find it extremely funny that you can speak Javanese, but with a really weird accent that they can't quite place. So, I've had my share of mockery, no, gentle mockery, culturally appropriate. And then you have like, guest performers, so there's a lot of things that can happen. But it's, these things happen together. So specific puppets like this guy here, Petruk, he's not only in the comic interludes. He's one of the characters that will be part of the comic interlude, but there's entire stories around Petruk. So they have like Petruk Tati Royo, like Petruk becomes the king. That's like a well-known storyline. Humor, but okay, so this isn't, so I would say like these puppets are not good discriminators. So you could train something just to identify this puppet, but that's not a good discriminator. Also, there's a lot of variation of how this character might appear. So it's a bit harder to label. Humor, I mean, they're not always that funny. Humor is also a hard thing to define. And sometimes the comic interlude can have like zero humor or zero laughter, or, it's not an essential quality. It can be there. Interaction with the audience, that's a key marker. So typically a comic interlude would have interaction with the audience, but not just that. So there would be a portion where you would, the Dalang would kind of turn back to the audience, ask a question to somebody there, request like what song you want us to play now, or invite somebody over. But that portion is smaller than the total comic interlude. So sure, you can just look for markers of interaction with the audience, but that's a subsection of the comic interlude. And the same thing goes true for guest performers. Okay, so you could, there's audio markers of an interlude. You could definitely listening for certain songs that are played, for certain ways of interacting with the audience. So that's kind of one possible way to do that. But then we don't have good models for, or we didn't at the time, for transcribing Javanese. So just transcribing this was not feasible. For the music is extremely complicated. So the simplest thing we thought is that if I were to present you with a sequence of bitmaps of frames, sample in this case at every 20 frames, if you don't even need to be a connoisseur, but if you know a little bit about Wayang, you will be able to identify the beginning and the end of the performance. Sorry, the beginning and the end of the comic interlude. So for example, if I show you just this one frame here, it might be a bit small. So this is our friend Petruk from the previous slide. So if you were to just look at this one slide here, you couldn't tell just by looking at it, is this part of the comic interlude or not? Maybe, but it could be part of other things. If you look at this one over here, guest performer, oh, right, definitely we are. So you can see there that there's somebody else on stage. So we are into this territory. And then here, we have another character that does not belong. Like this one is called Bimo. And this one does not belong to the comic interlude. So if you were to look at this kind of as a sequence, even without the audio, this is pretty easy for somebody to kind of label the beginning and the end of that sequence. And just to give you kind of maybe other examples that we use sometimes is, imagine that you're watching a film, or you're watching, you have a data set of TV shows, as some of you might have, just plucking it out of thin air. But let's imagine that you also had the commercial breaks included in that TV show. So if I show you a single frame of somebody walking down the street, could you tell me if that belongs, without knowing anything else, could you tell me from that single frame, is this part of the show or of the commercial break? You could probably not say that. But if you were to look at a longer span of bitmaps, even without the audio, you could probably guess. There would be other markers. Maybe you have a product placement. It would be visually different from other things. So by looking at the sequence, you would be able to identify, even without knowing anything about that particular show, the beginning and the end of this commercial break. This is not a perfect metaphor, but just to give you an intuition of why this might work here. So here, if you know a bit about Wayang, by looking at a single frame, so you cannot classify it, so this cannot be done through a single frame classification approach. But if you look at a title, like a sequence, you'd be able, a human expert would be able to identify, and not even an expert, I could teach these conventions to you in 20 minutes, and we could reach a reasonable level of agreement. So, okay, so now I've set the stage. I've introduced the question. I said, why, we were interested in this. I've been interested in this kind of idea of the comic interludes for a long time. And now, how like now that we know that there's a way to operationalize this question by using only the 2 dimensions of the visual information of the frame, but also time as a modality, as we learned also from this week, you'd be able to do that. So kind of like our question looks a little bit like this. It's like, we have like these 7 hours. We have like these frames, and we want to be able to label the beginning and the end of the interlude segment, and we want to say like what is not interlude, what is an interlude, and this is of course a problem, like a common type of problem, which is a temporal action segmentation problem, where you have like this untrimmed video, like here they call it a procedural video, where it can be that just means a video with a sequence of things, and then you can slice it into these temporal action segments. I took this image from this amazing. So this is so this at NUS this a lab, the computer vision and machine learning lab that they do video understanding, temporal action segmentation, and they've got a bunch of resources that I borrowed also for this research. They have like they keep a list of awesome papers in this space. So it's very well updated. So if you're interested in this, they have like an overview of metrics, definitions, and also like cool papers in this space. So maybe slightly more formally, what we want to do is that you have like a clip with like L frames, and you have like a set of N candidate actions, and you want to estimate for each action the time steps at which the action occurs in the video. So typically, people were not thinking about Wanklid when they did this. They have things like cooking videos. So you can see this like pour flour, pour milk. So you have like these like temporal labels that you apply to this video over here. Or people have these data sets like the open pack data set, which is like how long it takes you to assemble and package something. So like there's a big community of people interested in these kinds of things. For what I consider personally maybe not the most utopian applications. So for some people who are like warehouses from big tech companies want to know how long does a human take to pack something? When does a human go to take a toilet break? You want to minimize that, of course, because that's bad for revenue. And you want to optimize kind of like how much power you can extract from treating a human as a machine, basically. I'm sure there's more generous interpretations of that process, but not for me. But anyway, so people are interested in things like this. You want to see like this is the open pack data set. There's the IKEA assembly data set. People are interested also like in surveillance. David showed like this anomaly detection data set of like shoplifting. People have also done that not just for classification, but you want to know where the shoplifting is happening. Shoplifting, for example, is the kind of thing where if you were to look at a single frame of somebody putting something in their pocket, are they shoplifting? Maybe not. You want to look at the entire sequence, so you want to identify certain actions. So people are usually doing this because they want to catch something doing something wrong, or you want to optimize some process, some industrial thing. So just a super brief overview. So now I gave you like a slightly more in-depth description of Wanklid that anybody had signed up for. Now I'm going to overcompensate by giving you like a super brief overview of temporal action segmentation and what people typically do to solve this problem. So there's kind of, broadly speaking, 2 paradigms. So, okay, I'm going to speak primarily about supervised approaches. And within supervised approaches, there's kind of 2 main kind of, frameworks that people use. This one is actually maybe shown. Okay, I missed the one I wanted to show. Oh, that's very sad. Okay, so I accidentally don't have the one that I wanted to show first. But it's about using post detection, as some of us know a lot from like Pete's presentation earlier. So what they try to do is they take these, they use like convolutional neural networks to extract the pose of a person on a frame, and then you at some point determine whether that changes above a certain threshold where there's too much variation, and then you say, okay, that's probably another action. So this approach focuses on the individual frame. So you try to, in some ways, like featureize what's happening there. It could be through the skeleton. It could be some other kind of, feature extraction process. But you're trying to look at what's happening in that frame and compare that frame to things that came before and after, and at some point you decide that that's a bit different. This is kind of another framework where you can see this one called Don't Pour Cereal into Coffee. People have like amazing titles in this community. And what they're trying to do here is to devise like a grammar of actions. So there are certain sequences that cannot happen before other sequences. So in this approach, instead of looking at the individual frame, you try to look at the kind of like sequences of things that happen. So try to have some like loss function that predicts kind of, what things are likely to come before other things. And then use that as a way to segment your video. So these are like broadly two approaches that were typically developed independent of each other until in 2024, this paper came out, and there hasn't been anything after this. Like this one really like knocked everybody else out of the park, because what they did is amazing on two ways that I'll try to summarize briefly. So they try to combine both approaches. These like looking at a single frame and also looking at the sequence of things. So they call this a cross-attention temporal modeling. So I'll go into a bit more detail of the branches, but what you can imagine is they have like two branches looking at the same video simultaneously. One that is very kind of detail-oriented. So imagine that you give this task to somebody who's like very detail-oriented, that is just looking at what's happening in that frame. So that's your convolutional neural network looking at a single frame at a time. And then you have the other one that's more like the grammar, trying to impose some structure over the sequence. And that one's works a bit more like a transformer, like a bird model, if you will, that tries to predict like a sequence over time. And they do things in parallel until they converge on a prediction. So this was amazingly accurate. They kind of are as accurate as any other model before, but at a fraction of the compute costs. So this is way cheaper to run. And the other really cool thing here that is like particularly important for me is that they have like a GitHub repository where they allow you to kind of fine-tune these models based on these libraries. So very well documented, and it has even like this like use your own data and train things. You can also, like, there's a ton of things you can swap. You can use like different embedding models for how you're kind of generating the features of the frame, but you can adapt it basically to your data. And on that, that bell tells me that I need to perhaps be more quickly. So anyway, so this is the one that we wanted to use for all these reasons. So we looked at the literature of what's available, and this is like a pretty cool candidate. So we did an initial experiment a couple of years ago. Together with my student Sean Liu, which you'll see his credit coming up in a couple of slides. So as I said, like imagine we have like these two kind of branches, like these two different ways to kind of process what's happening here, and we are. So you have the transformer branch over here and the convolutional branch on the other side, and you basically kind of iterate through this process. So they have like these action tokens. It's like object tokens. You don't have some object detection, but they're trying to predict those. And then the other one is looking at the frames, and they go back and forth time and time again. They keep like balancing things out until they converge on some kind of average, and that's when you can have the frame-wise label that you apply here. So inspired by this approach, we in this workflow, again, this is like Sean Liu and myself. So Sean is a PhD student in physics. When he began this project, he was an undergraduate student who kind of walked into my class, a little bit like the classes like Tim teaches. And then, he said he wanted to work on some projects later on. So I hired him as a research assistant. So for those of you who are undergraduates, when you walk into these classes, be careful. You never know where you'll end up. You might be doing some segmentation and then some PhD in physics. So life can take you in all kinds of exciting and unpredictable directions. But I digress. Let's go back to action segmentation. So we have this data and we have these videos. So we manually labeled 100 videos on a custom platform that is also openly available. So it was first done on Streamlit. Now we have a more a leaner way to do this, and I'll show you the repository later on. And so we labeled, as I showed you, the beginning and the end of these segments, which they're not exactly actions. So I'll come back to that, why I still think this makes sense, even though they're not action in the conventional sense. But we thought, okay, let's just try it out. Would this even work at all? And to our surprise, this was kind of pretty cool. So let me show you how do people typically evaluate the accuracy of these metrics. So there's different approaches, but what the people that use FACT use, and what most people in the community do, is they try to think of this as a classification problem. So how do you turn a segmentation problem into a classification problem? Well, so the first thing that you do is you try to do this intersection over union. So those of you familiar, this is done also like for images, image segmentation, or for segments. So you take like the intersection of the ground truth and the predicted one. So let's say that the ground truth is here, the predicted is here. So this tiny kind of part where they overlap, and then you divide that by the union of both. So if there's no intersection, if it's predicting something that is totally off, the number will always be 0. It's like a fraction, so it doesn't matter what the denominator is. It will always be 0 if there's no intersection. And then you can imagine that if it intersects, depending on how much it intersects, it will be a fraction of 1. So if you have like a perfect intersection that's 1, that's like it exactly matches. Now, because we want to take this into a classification problem, we don't want to be that stringent. So what people do is they calculate this at different thresholds. So you can say, okay, at threshold 10, so that means if your IOU is, 10%, or 0.1, then you would count it as correct. Or you can be more stringent. You can say like, I need the IOU to be at least 20 or 50. People usually only go until 50, and then you count that as it's correct or it's not. And then you can, everybody here does F1 scores. I've seen a number of these before, so you're familiar with that. So you take these, precision and recall, and you calculate your F1 score to a harmonic mean of these two values. And so that's how we get to these numbers. So it's actually pretty impressive, maybe a bit too impressive. So we might have done something wrong. So I welcome any kind of like suggestions of where we can go and figure this out. But it tells you, again, it's not perfect. So you only need to not overlap 50%. Your IOU needs to be like at least 0.5 out of 1. And yet, we were able to do this pretty cool thing. Now, let me show you some kind of more, some evaluation of the results. We presented this at CHR 2024, which is also where Naitian, who presented earlier, was there. Presented like I think at the same panel as me, perhaps. So yeah, that's and we are. So here you can see, this is not totally of the mark. Sometimes the place where they are is a little bit different. One thing that so this is from, so sometimes you don't have like a real comic interlude. So there are performances with no comic interlude, like this performance here. It's interpreted, but it has very sadly very little humor and no proper kind of clownery. That's okay. But if you have that, the model is still biased to predicting 1. So that's a limitation. But you can see they're not totally off the mark, just some eyeballing. And so anyways, we went back to so the next part is a little bit on less firmer ground. So as this talk progresses, I began on very kind of firm ground. Why include it? I can answer any question about it. I feel like having my expertise about that. But the more we move into this territory, the shape here, the ground comes from me. And now we're going to go to some experimental results that have some issues that I'll address later. But just to see, to come back to the original question of could we answer this empirically, plausibly, this empirical question that could be potentially answered through this method. So what does the data tell us? So we try to look at change over time. One issue, as you recall, is that we are getting more. So the number of performances that we have over time increases over time. So this is not a perfectly distributed census of the real Wankley performances. There's all kinds of biases of why a performance might be on YouTube, especially in the early years. We started in 2019 because from then on, we have a little bit more performances. And then we sampled, can recall now, 1,000 performances, 100 performances per year, sorry, 100 performances per year from then on. And, but still, like you have these, as somebody described, like, we have this situation, I don't know who made like that gesture, where like every year you have more stuff that also, so to in some ways kind of, control for that, we take a sample of the same size, like for each year. So for each year, we sample 100 performances, although in some ways, like in some years, we're sampling 100 out of like, 2,000 performances, but in 2023, we sampled 100 out of 7,000. So there's some, potential for misrepresentation there. Plus also the fact that now we capture probably a lot more of what's out there, whereas even 5 years ago, there's some bias that determines what things get on YouTube, and it's a bit hard to estimate what that might be. So again, this is not perfect. I'm not totally convinced that this is absolutely true. There's also like a variation here in the kind of like the standard deviation is the shaded area, but the solid line does seem to indicate that actually in the past 5 years, the comic include has increased over time, which took me by surprise. I was absolutely sure this was not going to be the case. Because like, how could it always increase? That's but it could also be that it's a correction. Like, it could be this, like as we saw like in David's presentation, it could be that they were very long, then they decreased, so we don't know that for sure. We also thought, okay, maybe it could be that the performances that are longer, like where the comic interlude are longer, are the ones that are more popular. So this is more present in people's mind because the ones that are very popular are more like have longer interludes, which are easier to watch. So we try to look at that by looking at view count and like count, and there's no kind of clear pattern of correlation here. Again, there's a ton of limitations, so this is all very preliminary. But let me just kind of preempt some questions you might have by first, kind of being critical of what I've just presented. So some limitations is that, okay, so I had a reviewer once that said, yeah, well, these will not work because these are not actions. And I'm like, well, what do we mean by actions, really? I mean, so they said, it's unlikely that these models would work because they're used for things that are more shorter. That you have like, a video of like somebody chopping a banana or doing other things, which, sure, but I don't know why, like, if there's like a technical reason why you cannot extend that to a longer frame. That would be like saying something like, you cannot possibly use, NLP to study novels because this was originally developed for emails, which are shorter. So, you cannot extend it to something else. Which I'm like, no, I'm not sure that that's a valid reason. Plus, also the results show me that this does work. It's entirely possible I did something, wrong. I welcome ideas to probe into what that might be, but I don't think that the fact that the nomenclature is different, there's no reason, like, there's no kind of concept of action. We're just looking at, the kind of probability that these two branches converge at a decision point, and given like the input that comes before. So, anyways, but that's still like, maybe there's something there. Of course, as I said, we have again opportunistic sample. This is a census of YouTube, and not of Wayne performances. So we have like, everything that's on YouTube that is like Wayne from Java, but not of Wayne itself. So like the phenomenon is not the same thing as the record of the phenomenon, but that's true for any and everything that we study. So this bias in early years, it's hard to estimate. It's also a small sample size. So we have like 100 videos for training and 10 videos for testing. So there could be something there that we need to explore a bit more. And then the other limitation is like, wait, I thought we were going to talk about dance, if you remember my title. So let me kind of address that in a moment. But how are we doing time?
Let's say 11 minutes.
Oh, okay. 11 minutes. Okay, I think I can do this in 11 minutes. Yeah.
We can give you some plus minus.
11 minutes is perfect. I'll give you the shorter version. So, okay. So the dance, why is it not about dance? I'll talk about dance in a moment. But then the other question is like, is this really multimodal? I have been wondering about this when I got invited here, and then, well, so somebody provided me with the excellent, shortcut, which is, time is a modality. Okay, I've got that covered. But also, I've seen all these, incredible work this week of people using these truly multimodal models, or models that present themselves as being truly multimodal. Pete presented a few of those, and of course, David earlier. So like Gemini and the like. So I just had to kind of, try this out. So this is just a very exploratory experiment, not consistent in any way, but it's like really like a probe, really. I just wanted to figure out what Gemini could do about Y-encoded performances. And I just tried this kind of, so I made this kind of super simple interface that sends videos to Gemini. So this is the 2.5 flash, because I'm not paying for the core version, but it's just to figure out what it knows. And so here, the idea that I had is that I would give it a snippet of a video, and I would, because I'm interested in segmentation more than classification, so I wanted to know if it could identify a smaller segment. So like comic interlude is a bit harder, so can it say something about a smaller thing? So here it says, I don't know if you can read, it says the dalang. So dalang is the main performer. It speaks all the character parts, moves all the puppets. Dalang removes the puppet entirely from the scene. The puppet must be taken out of the camera view entirely. Because I tried first, like it says removes, and it would just take moments where like the puppet is like plugged out, moves, and gets plugged back in. So I said, no, it needs to be taken out entirely. And well, so it completely hallucinates the time references here. So I tried, so I'm not going to show the interface. It says, it identifies once at 0, 0 to 0, 0, and it's amazing. From 0, 0, 0, the line removes the Gattaceno, then 0, 0, like the same thing. So these are totally kind of, completely hallucinated. It repeats the same thing several times. But one thing that blew my mind, so actually there's there's two clear puppet departures in this segment. Maybe I'll show you the segment. I can use some of my.
Sing ciptonggon kepingin gayo kasampurnan. Ngadil buglun lan mateng pun syarat lan lalu stok rawiroso
But at some point, he's taking his puppet out, going around, and he says the name of the puppet. It's like, Gotoseno, which is, and then that's something. So here you can see the name of the puppet. So like the final A in Javanese is pronounced O, so Gajaseno. And this is crazy that it managed to catch the reference to this character. Because, I'm pretty sure it didn't memorize this. This is like one performance out of like, hundreds of thousands on YouTube. This is an incredibly uncommon character. And so sometimes also in Wayang, you have like certain characters that are called like stock characters. So like the elephant character can represent just an elephant, can represent a million different characters. In this particular performance, in this very specific rendition, the Dalang decides to call him Gajaseno, which is like the honorable young elephant, which is like a very kind of like, like a really kind of, I would be surprised to listen to that. And he said that at the same time that it's music, and yet like I didn't prompt it to have that, and yet it says, it has the name correctly spelled. So there's a lot of things there, like a lot of potential that is exciting. So yeah, definitely, again, it's just a preliminary kind of probe, partially done to the fact that I'm jet lagged and I have to find something to occupy myself and at night, but also because I heard these great examples and I had to just try it for myself. So anyways. Okay, but let me tell you more about why did I call this dance? So it could have been theater, it could have been puppetry, but I think that more broadly, where do I think this could be applicable? And I think it's for things that are a bit like dance, like traditions that are highly codified. And where you have, for example, like, highly codified movement traditions, like in this case, like, for, like different versions, like Chinese opera, like Hokkien opera, Cantonese opera. You have like these different character types that move in particular ways. So depending on whether you're like the Chou character or the Shen character, you do similar things differently. This applies to like gestural vocabularies, and I almost. Yeah. So like gestural vocabularies. So this is an example. So this is like my colleague, Dr. Ganesh. Here he's himself a Kathakali performer and computer scientist. He did this project looking at mudras in Kathakali, which is like a very specific dance drama from southern India. And you could kind of look at this kind of stuff for things like dance. So I think this is like, where does this make sense? The kinds of things that I'm suggesting is in these kinds of traditions. Just to give you kind of another example, like, this is from so at some point I was also interested in Javanese dance. So I study all kinds of things connected to, Southeast Asian cultural heritage. So you have like this dictionary of dance where you have like different movements, and you have descriptions of what they are. And we did a project some time ago where we didn't do anything computationally. I mean, not in the way we understand that now. So just copy this. This is not exact. It's not a good way to use my remaining time. Let me just show this to you. So here, I mean, we recorded dancers with these like optical marker systems. So we put like a bunch of different like markers on them, and have like this like a camera system and these like force plates in a sports lab that now doesn't exist anymore. And we recorded the characters doing something which is like they would be in a kneeling position and they will stand up. And so in a particular version of this tradition, they all do this. So when the characters enter the stage, they kneel and they stand up. The reason for that is that there was in the past, the entire performance like people were kneeling for the entire performance. But anyway, so now there's this remnant that is still practiced sometimes where they're kneeling and then they stand up. So we recorded dancers performing the same motion of standing up according to different character types. So here you do it in a humble, strong way. And then we did some like biomechanical analysis of that. And then you do the same thing with this auto character. So it's doing the same thing, but slightly differently. So you can compare that. And then, so what I would like to do, if anybody is like, I don't know, idealistic enough to fund me to do that, is to kind of like try to extend this. Like we could do this for this kind of work that we did in the past for like entirely like video-based motion capture, or even like action segmentation to compare this. And now I'm going to bring it to my final point, and the last part of the subtitle of my talk is like this, like Emic approaches. So for people who study culture, like often there's this distinction between like the Emic and the etic. And so Emic, the way I like to describe this is that we use concepts from within an epistemic community. So the way that a community of practice, a community of meaning making refers to its own categories, its own way of making sense of the cultural world, that would be like Emic. And then etic is when it's coming from outside of that community. And you might want to use both for different reasons. So if you want to do something that is broadly comparative, you might want to deploy an etic framework. But for things that are like you want to really study something within its own cultural and symbolic context, you might want to use an Emic. And this is originally developed by a linguist by the name of Kenneth Pike, but adapted to anthropology. So and then people sometimes use it to say, oh, Emic means that you are an insider to the community, but I think that's a misunderstanding. You don't need to be an insider. It's not about you. It's about your frame of reference. So an insider can decide to use, you can talk about like, social organization, borrowing kind of like very global terms, or you can use like your local, epistemic conventions for that. But I think that this is extremely cool and a unique opportunity we have now in computational humanities, that we can fine-tune open weights models to allow us to operationalize Emic theories. Why this is cool is because in the past, if you wanted to study cultural phenomena, we're kind of like stuck with things that are very universal or that are very kind of premised on maybe like Euro-American traditions. But now you can easily think about how a particular community of practice makes sense of their history, their tradition, their conversations, and use that, deploy that for labeling things according to whatever conventions you think of, and fine-tune and open weights models for that. I think this is extremely cool. Why do we do this? Well, it can help us understand how cultural traditions change over time, how they adapt tropes from other media, and how they respond to external cultural influences. So this is very much what I think we can do. So I'm trying to also respond to, the questions that team presented to us at the beginning. Like, where do we want cultural analytics to go? And I want to go a discussion like, does this resonate with you? Does this make any sense at all? But like the kinds of future cultural analytics that I see, they don't need to include action segmentation. It might be that we just do classification of video. But this idea that we can use these powerful models and then tweak them to represent things that are unique to this thing that we study, be it like, kind of Scandinavian films or like silent era movies, we can do something that is really capturing the nuances of our objects of study. And also in the spirit of reproducibility, we've got these GitHub repository where we have like these pipelines. So it's out there, like we have like a pipeline board for like, borrowing things from YouTube, which, so like how would you like a search for extracting things from YouTube? We have like a labeling interface that it's, maybe I can show you later. So basically you have like a text file where you assign the labels that you want. And then you have like a keyboard where, you say at what rate you want to sample, and then you use the mouse. So it's very easy to label things very quickly. And it's better. So we made it because I was not comfortable with the other things that I saw out there. So, and then we have like these, a wrapper around the fact model trainer. So like if you want to fine tune something for fact. So I think that this is something that, I hope somebody will take at some point, it's easy to use for like a class project perhaps, or some experiment that you can label things, fine tune a fact model. And we also have examples using how will you do this for labeling for the breakfast action data sets or that kind of stuff. So anyways, thank you for bearing with me. This has been a pleasure. And yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
And I'll try and moderate this conversation, and I'll also check to see if there are questions coming in from Zoom. I once again am going to take the moderator's what do you call that, prerogative and ask the first question. I love this presentation of what I recognize, particularly as you come back to Emic and Edic, a wonderful exploration of computational folkloristics, where you're looking at this vernacular cultural processes with all of their variation and their circulation on and across social networks. What I'm interested in, and you brought this up near the end, is the impact of cultural heritage policies on regional and national, as the heritage policies of both regional and national governments on performance, including on these traditions. Is there a convergence that you see onto a specific set of texts, right? You were almost talking like Albert Lord here at the very beginning, and a subset of puppets for specific scenes. Is this measurable or not measurable? This is kind of going to my real interest, which is on repertoire and school.
Yeah.
So
I would love to answer those questions. So I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
So people have theorized that the rise of television has actually made some of these performers incredibly well known and incredibly wealthy. There's like a whole book again that one of my mentors, Javanese, wrote called Wayang and Television. It's called A Marriage Full of Conflict. Wayang and Television. So he talks about it's like a more like ethnographic approach about the impact of television, and people thought that television would destroy Wayang, but then there was so much like Wayang on television that it created these superstars that they became like fabulously wealthy and very well known, and everyone started to copy their style. So before you could only have access to people in your immediate vicinity. Now you get access to people that are like nationally well known, so you can copy their sabetan, their movement technique. So there's some ethnographic evidence for that. I would love to try to answer those kinds of questions with this. I suspect it's possible with the data set that we have access to. And it would be also about quantifying style, what does style mean here for doing the same movement in a different way, who is copying whom. So I think that we also have like geographical information. So it's not something we've done, but it's something I would love to. This is the kind of like big picture question that
Perfect opportunity for collaboration. Because I used to work at the Cultural Properties Preservation Bureau in Korea, where we were going around certifying people for inclusion in the Registry of National Living Treasures for their intangible cultural properties. And there was this tension between shaman rituals in little villages and what we called superstar kud, the superstar, and the tension between that. So I think that's a wonderful answer, actually, that we don't have the answer yet, and there are opportunities for collaboration. But yeah.
I have a question about this.
Great.
So, I mean, I did studies, ritual studies, and a lot of things happen before or after. Kind of, when they start to report. Sometimes there could be like something happening before or after. Is that something you think about, or does that not apply to this?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. It actually does happen here a lot that people have like speeches before. Sometimes you can even have like a whole ritual before. But yeah, you often have it's sponsored by a common reason to sponsor a banquet show is because there's like the anniversary of like an institution, like a bank or a school. So you have like a bunch of scripts, like a bunch of speeches beforehand. So we did initially label those things, and we wanted to kind of identify those. But then I thought, well, it doesn't matter because we want to know the duration, the absolute duration of the comic interlude relative to the entire performance. No, not in its own, not relative to the performance. So just the duration of the comic interlude. So it's something we thought about, but we didn't pursue because it was not the key thing for this initial pilot study. So this was part of the pilot study that I wanted to do. I applied for a larger grant based on that, and I didn't get the larger grant. So it's now kind of completed the drawing board until this invitation came and that brought this back to life. But that's a really interesting thing. That sometimes they do leave the camera on before and after, and there's also all kinds of things that we could study from there. So yeah.
That's sort of an interesting movement, what Times called breakthrough into performance. So when do you break into performance, and when do you, and where is that? Yeah, David, you had a question.
Yes, thank you for an awesome talk. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how do you think it's possible to really get an Emic model when you're fine-tuning an open model that's already been trained on thousands of hours of user data? Like, to what extent are you able to get out the kind of edict stuff that you wouldn't want to perform the open model behaviors?
So I don't. Well, So I think
maybe actually a different way, a simpler way of asking this question is just how much data do you need in order to train and enable me just without relying on fine-tuning something else?
Right. Yeah. So I don't know the answer to the question. I'll tell you what I mean by Emic is the categories are Emic, and then this is that in some ways if you're using there's other classification models before you can think about text classification. That you get things that are for classifying spam and not spam. That's a very kind of general universal. But now increasingly we can classify for a very specific set of categories, and we can do that in the case of text or whatever matters to a particular set of questions. But whether that's intrinsically and philosophically Emic in the workings of the model, I don't know. I just don't know if it matters that much. You can think about the error distribution as the non-Emic parts of the model, perhaps. And in some ways, if you're doing like a per model, you're not doing a full fine-tune, just shifting the classification heads. But you can still say, well, it's Emic because the categories are predicted are not general for fiction, they're universal, but things that are very specific to this particular group of literary scholars. So I would argue that that approach is Emic. When it comes to what the model actually is looking at and it doesn't, I don't know, and that's something that I would have loved to do, or would still love to do if anybody wants to, continue with that, is to kind of try to look at some explainable approach to these models, to try to figure out what exactly they're doing. Because I mean, the results are pretty good, so that's also maybe an indication that maybe I did something wrong somewhere, or not. I mean, it's the kind of thing that we could study a bit further. We also thought at some point that we could have our own kind of video embedding model trained entirely on YouTube, so that you're not getting whatever randomness is out there. Although it seems to not matter that much. That's the other thing that we sometimes find with kind of open weights models in order dimensions, that even though it's trained on everything, it might still perform better than something that's trained only on your domain. Let me give you an example of something that my colleagues did at the National AI Institute in Singapore. No, the AI Singapore. So they have these models for Southeast Asian languages. When they first started, they trained the models entirely from scratch, and they got some pretty good performance. Now they are taking the Gemma model from Google and just like doing some post training, and it's incredibly more powerful than what they could do from scratch. Even though they had a budget of $50 million to train that from scratch. So I cannot do that kind of experiment, but I suspect that sometimes really it feels wrong, but I don't know. It's interesting that you can get these kind of very powerful open weights models, and you can selectively lobotomize them, kind of perform well at a narrowly constrained task, and that might be better than training from scratch. So I think that these varies a lot on the domain and the question, and it's something that I would like doing some XAI, some explainable AI for this. Like, why exactly is it wrong or not? Something that I'd like to know more about. I don't have a question. I don't have an answer. I just think it's a great question.
Mikael, you just choose your.
Oh, sorry.
I'm really curious as to what hypothesis as to why the combination with is getting longer. I'm thinking maybe that they're roasting people longer, or that this makes it stand up coming in as an influence in YouTube as a platform is creating incentives for maybe longer, or maybe just simply so with temporal action segmentation. Do you think that could be something that you could apply this hypothesis for being correct?
So I mean, I'll say two things about that. One is that I definitely wanted to. This is supposed to be a pilot project, but then just to try something that very kind of coarse grained. That I actually never thought it was going to work this well. But then do something like smaller about the subsets of all the different things that happen in a performance. Even within the comic interlude, you have the portion where the characters, the comic characters enter. The portion with the interaction with the audience, the portion where you have perhaps a guest performer coming on stage. So you could definitely train models for each of those smaller, finer, coarse, fine grained actions, and that would be interesting to look at the characteristics of these. I think that would be the kind of the right way to explore that further is to go into smaller actions. Now, when it comes to why, I'm always very careful about why questions, or very skeptical about my own capacity to answer those questions. I think it's very hard in this kind of realm to hypothesize about causality, because the number of things that might be influencing this is way too many, and I don't have. So I think that for knowing, you would need to know so many things about who is the sponsor, what the sponsor wants, micro decisions about things that are happening. So I just think that that's really hard. I mean, I'd love to know how other people think about that, but kind of maybe also the kind of work that I find really interesting is descriptive. I think that description itself, the interpretation, and sometimes we've been told to not describe things, but I think careful description of the world is part of what we try to do, not so much explanation. And I think that the other side of that is that maybe for explanation, other methods that are not computational are better. Because I feel like any model that I would try to reduce this to a custom model would be too simplistic, be informative. That I would just feel like I'm cheating somewhere. It would be too. But you could ask also, a sample of the project. But that's just kind of my take of it. But I love to think about the subsequent stuff. Thank you. Was there another?
Yeah, oh, this is like a slightly different set of questions, but one thing that struck watching the videos of the recordings was, the way the light's projecting onto the characters.
Yeah.
And I was curious if like the size of the character's projection onto
Yeah.
the screen is like an element of the storytelling.
Mhm.
Because that seems like kind of a cool thing to measure too over time.
Yeah.
As characters and their shadows get like bigger and smaller, and the way those relations are happening. And it's just like another interesting over time shift possibly.
Yeah.
And it seems fundamental, yeah. I was just curious if I even important.
Absolutely, it's
Yeah.
super important. Yeah, it's a great detail that you picked up on because so typically the characters would just come for a more like dialogue heavy scene. They would just like come into the scene and you have like a bit of the shadow as they come in to represent that they're coming in, and they will be very static. And also like for most of the dialogue they will be almost not moving at all. Sometimes sometimes they will like lift the hand to emphasize a point, but they're kind of pretty static. So it's like a tableau with like a voiceover, except some scenes that are very dramatic, where you would definitely have like this play with shadow.
Okay.
And there's usually like when there's some kind of a preparation for battle, or some spiritual revelation, or some kind of like trust. So many of these stories are about mistaken identity. So a character disguising as another character. So at some point when you have like a big reveal of who's the real character, you have like these shadows to kind of show like this kind of two separating out. So they're definitely you can say that whenever there's a shadow in the middle of the screen, it's because it's a very important moment for the narrative.
Yeah.
If the shadows on the sides, it's probably just them coming in and out. But actually, I had not thought about that. And maybe we can do like a segment anything just to find the shadows. Because that's probably the kind of thing, that's a super cool idea. Something, yeah.
Well,
yeah,
it seems
yeah,
like also
yes,
like
yeah.
that's kind of connected to your
Yeah.
Emic idea,
Yeah.
right? Or Emic's bigger, but anyway, like the story world of the community, the story world's own,
Mhm.
like like narrative structure or like forms of events that tell you something.
Mhm.
That would be a cool like way to also a custom model or customization of something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like that.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Very thought-provoking. I think David asked like the first order version of the question that I wanted to ask, but I'm like really interested in this like Emic distinction. So I want to like maybe ask for more discussion about that, which is like when I think of this like Emic distinction, it's about like what kinds of differentiation is meaningful to like the person within the community of practice versus like what kind of differentiation, like what is meaningful difference to someone outside, right? And I guess like before we get even to like the pre-training data of like models, right? Like the thing that I think of when I think of differentiation is like tokenization, right? In that like when you do tokenization, like that is the first step where you're saying like these two things are the same thing or these two things are different things, right? And then like everything goes on from there, right? And so like that's why we see that like sometimes language models are weird for like non-Latin alphabet like characters, right? It's because like there's like weird tokenization stuff that's going on. But I'm curious, like, how you're thinking about to what extent you can like impose these kind of like Emic priors, like these Emic categories on like the output, like the categories of the output, for example, and to what extent like maybe it makes sense to build that into like the like architecture of the model, for example, right? Or like how you're like setting up the model, or like how you're pre-processing the data.
Yeah, so it's a bit like similar to like David's question, and I would kind of I like refer to also what I said, and like maybe what I would say is like these models are not they're functionally Emic, but they're not like mechanistically Emic. They're not like the weights are not inherently Emic, whatever that might mean. It's just like they behave like the output of these models is something we could describe as being Emic. Does it matter how we kind of? I think it matters how we label the data more than how we tokenize. Because even if you think about tokenization for other languages, you can so sometimes you can use a tokenizer. So I work on Indonesian and Malay, also like texts, and you can use tokenizers for those languages that were developed for general purpose NLP tasks, and still kind of have a fine-tuned classification model that predicts something very specific to literature as opposed to email. So I think that's kind of how we think about this as more as how we think about the labeling and the evaluation more than how we think about what goes into the vowels of the model or the tokenizer. Which, as I said, it could be counterintuitive. Sometimes taking a model that was trained on everything can still perform better for these fine-tuned tasks than something that was entirely trained on that task. But that's something that I think invites a lot more debate and experiments. So I think that there's a ton of cool experiments that somebody can do about that.
Great. And with that gesture towards more discussion, more investigation of that, which we'll be doing down at the AI Futures Lab. I'd like to thank Miguel once again for joining us. Probably next program.